Hi everyone, super lovely to meet you and to see you. My name's Maddie and I'm an engagement lead at Involve, the UK's leading public participation charity. And I'll let my lovely colleague Elizabeth introduce herself as well.
Hiya, I'm Elizabeth. I'm also an engagement lead at Involve, but I have a specific focus on science, technology, and data.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth and I are going to take you through a kind of a whistle-stop tour of some things to think about when you're thinking about different participatory methodologies in your work. But just a little bit about Involve. So as I said, we are a public participation charity, and we believe that everyone should have a say in decisions that impact their lives, because really that's what democracy should be all about. We also believe that by involving people in all levels of decision making, we can build happier, healthier, and more cohesive societies that works for everyone, because it's actually shaped by the needs and the wants of everyone. But before we get into kind of why we think public engagement is great, because obviously we do, otherwise we wouldn't work at Involve, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts and your perspectives. So I'm just going to pop a link, or Elizabeth is going to pop a link in the chat for you to a Menti poll. And I'd love it if you could go on the Menti poll, or you can scan the QR code, and you should have two questions. One, why is public engagement important in general? And then why should we do public engagement on data and AI? And Gavin already gave some spoilers for that earlier, so hopefully you've got some good prompts there.
Is it live?
I'll give you a couple of minutes and then I think there we go. So we've got a couple coming through already. So why is public engagement important? It's democratic. We've got some things there about democracy. Nothing about us without us. Brilliant. Love that that's come up a couple of times. Including the voices from diverse backgrounds. Our personal opinions are biased. That's really interesting. Really, how do we make sure that we're kind of including and engaging people from lots of different backgrounds in conversations rather than people that we often hear from? Consensus building, love to see that. Love to see that coming through. And to build trust and it's like someone's already looked at the slides, Elizabeth, and they're guessing ahead. Do you know
We've
what
got
I
nothing to
mean?
teach these people.
I know. I'm like, you know it all already. It's great. Yeah, in particular, I think they're like having non-diverse tech teams means harms can get missed. So really thinking about that kind of inclusion and accessibility, that shifting of power. Who is currently making the decisions? And why are more people not getting involved in the first place? So why should we do public engagement on data and AI? If what's come through from why public engagement in general is really about kind of inclusion, about caring for people, about democracy, about nothing with us without us, then why should we do public engagement on data and AI specifically? It affects everyone, and we know that it affects everyone. And I think we're seeing an increased awareness in general across society of how much data and AI does impact us all. So we need to be aware of how it impacts us so that we can make informed choices about what we do.
I really like the second point as well, where this is mindful as well. Like, we can do this. There are ways to do it, but doing it in a truly mindful way does require lots of input to get different perspectives. I think that's important.
Brilliant. It won't be successful unless we bring everyone with us. Absolutely. We see this kind of across different like policy spaces as well, is that to make things as kind of useful and impactful as possible, it's got to come and reflect the needs of people, the needs and their values. Brilliant. So we've got a lot here about kind of awareness raising, about kind of, increasing knowledge, but also who's getting to kind of dominate and who's getting to make the decisions again. Brilliant. Fantastic. Some really interesting stuff coming through here, guys. It's super useful to hear your reflections as well. Elizabeth, anything else jumping out to you?
Other than the term tech bros made me laugh. Um, but yeah, it's nothing without us, I think,
Yeah.
is just key. That it's our data. Without our data, there's nothing here. So it's really important to bring everyone along with us and to hear the voices of everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks, team. What I'll do is I will share those with you afterwards so that everyone's got access to them as well. But brilliant. It's great to hear your views and perspectives. So we at Involve specialise in public engagement, and data is one of the elements that we look at, data and AI, but we look at it kind of more broadly. So it's wonderful to kind of gather your views and perspectives and hear about those too. But why do we think public engagement is good in general? So good quality public engagement for us is really about power. It's about shifting power towards people about issues that impact them the most. It's also about building collaborative two-way relationships between decision makers and people and kind of members of the public. We so often see in our processes when we run them that once there's kind of starts off with kind of mutual distrust, but actually through the process of getting to know each other, people start to see each other's perspectives, and that's not just participants, but that is decision makers and the public, and they start to see what other trade-offs that we're having to consider on each side, and it can really help to kind of build and foster that collaborative relationship and trust. Public engagement also brings people with different perspectives, needs, and contexts together to address and find answers to complex problems and predicaments that we face as a society. So it's really an opportunity for us to combine our collective knowledge and wisdom to create and craft solutions that work for everyone. And it's also a great way to help us find common ground on difficult and challenging issues that we will only continue to face in the 21st century. So from the Involved perspective, this is kind of really at the heart of why we believe in the work that we do. But you can do public engagement not so well. So one of the things we also focus on is how to do really good quality public engagement. And here's just a couple of things that we think is super important for any type of public engagement work that we're doing. So we think that there must be a clear purpose for the engagement so that those who are giving their time are aware of what they'll be discussing and where their discussions and their decisions will go. It needs to be properly resourced in terms of time, money, and expertise. As we were talking a bit about earlier, there needs to be a big focus on accessibility and inclusion so that we can remove barriers to participating in the first place, and then remove kind of barriers that we might face within our engagement to make sure that everyone's voices and perspectives are being heard as well. At Involve, we're really passionate about paying people what we call a gift of thanks or a thank you gift for their time, and also covering all expenses that people might incur to take part in the engagement. So that could be covering childcare costs, travel costs, or kind of any other expenses that people might face. And really that's about removing that financial barrier to participation for people. We also think it's really important to provide balanced information to participants so that they can weigh up the information and reach informed decisions and conclusions themselves. And it's ultimately super important to have accountable decision makers who are committed to listening and responding to the recommendations. And that can be responding to say, unfortunately, we can't implement this because of X, Y, and Z, but it's so important for that accountability and for that transparency in what can happen next. So at Involve, we talk about and we use the IAP2 spectrum of participation to talk about the different types of engagement that you can do. You might have seen something similar, maybe Arnstein's ladder of participation or kind of other things. But the reason that we use the spectrum is because we really believe that there's not necessarily a hierarchy in different types of engagement. So empowerment or kind of things that fit in that empower box aren't always better than things that are in the involve box, for instance. It really depends on the aims, the scope, the time and the resources that you have available to do your public engagement or your engagement. But I'll talk through just kind of what an example of each of these could look like. So let's say we have a local authority and they want to do some public engagement around kind of net zero and specifically around retrofit in their local community. So if we were to take an inform approach to this, that could be a public communications campaign about retrofit opportunities that are going on in the local area. If we wanted to do something in the consult box, we could do an online survey where we're asking for feedback on a couple of different options that the council have pulled together about retrofit. So they've kind of popped those on an online survey and then people can put in their perspectives and their opinions and we'll gather those down. If we wanted to do something in the involved column, that could be something like a citizens jury or a citizens panel to explore different retrofit options and create recommendations that can then be taken and explored by the council or by the local authority. If we wanted to do something that is around collaboration, that could be maybe doing a mixed methods approach where we get the participants to help define and set the agenda of a citizens jury or of some kind of citizens panel. We then do the citizens panel, and then we bring those same people back to actually help look on the accountability of the panel and track progress on how well the council's doing to kind of implement the recommendations that have come out. Or we could look at something in the empower section. So that could be something like participatory budgeting to look at how we could allocate funding for retrofit in a local area. So those are some examples of like what the same topic could look like in all of those different stages. At Involve, we mainly focus on the three in the middle, the three in blue, although we do occasionally support with some Empower projects, but there are lots of other organisations who do brilliant work specialising in the kind of inform section. And I think it is really important to note that like good information and good communication is super important and is actually something we see that comes out of a lot of our processes is people develop all of their recommendations and there is always a recommendation about better public communication because that's always a piece that seems to be missing to people. But if those are the broad categories of engagement, you're probably super interested to hear like, okay, what are the methods? Like, what are the different methods that we could look at? It's very tempting to jump straight into method selection. And we often see when we work with commissioners that they'll get in touch with us and they'll be like, oh, guys, we've heard about citizens' assemblies. They're super exciting. We really want to do one. But what they haven't done is think, is this actually the right method for us? So we always encourage people to think about these 6 steps before they go on to deciding their method. So we always get people to think about the scope. What is in and out of scope of this project? What level of influence are you actually able to offer to the public? There is no point in doing a citizens' assembly if no one can commit to kind of even looking at any of the recommendations or doing anything with those recommendations. We also think about internal impact. So what level of buy-in do you have internally for the decisions that need to be implemented? How is the information going to be incorporated into existing or new plans, policies and strategies? And why do you want to talk about this now? Like, why is this relevant now? Why is this a hot topic for you and in your organisation now? What about the purpose? Why are you actually engaging with people? What sorts of questions do you want to ask people? Are you looking for lots of ideas, for trade-offs, for priorities, principles, recommendations? What do you actually want to get out of your engagement that you want to do? And then obviously it becomes the question about time. How much time do you have for the engagement? And it's really important when we think about public engagement that there isn't just the actual delivery of the workshop or series of workshops. It's all the time that goes into that prep work of setting up your oversight or setting up your advisory groups, of gaining buy-in from key decision makers and actors, of doing your recruitment, of doing your onboarding and supporting your participants. You've then obviously got your delivery time, and then you've got all of the follow-up stuff that comes as well. So you're reporting, making sure that you're feeding back to the participants what's come up and what is going to happen with the outputs that they've come up with. And then how are you evaluating the work that you're doing? So it's really important when thinking about what type of engagement to do to consider all of that within your time frame and your parameters to help reach the decision about which method might work best for you. Likewise, you've got to think about reach. Who do you actually want to hear from? You know, we often think people are just like, oh, we just want a reflective sample of the population. But is that actually who you want to hear from? Or do you want to hear from a diverse range of people? Do you want to hear from self-selecting groups? Or do you want to hear from kind of specific communities or groups that might be, that the topic might be specifically relevant to, or maybe you're not hearing from enough in other types of engagement that you're doing? Do you want to reach loads of people, but potentially not go into so much detail? Or do you want to reach fewer people, but get like really in-depth discussions? So it's important to think about kind of who you want to reach and how many people you want to reach as part of the engagement. And then finally, obviously the big one, resources. What are your direct and indirect costs that you have available to do the engagement? So your direct costs are obviously things like your recruitment, paying your gift of thanks, venues, speakers, external facilitation or kind of design support if you're bringing that in. And then obviously your indirect costs are kind of staff time. Whenever we talk about costs, I think with public engagement, I think it's also really important to remember that by doing public engagement, we can head off kind of long-term risks in the future, because doing good public engagement to support and inform policy and decision making means that we will make better policy choices. We'll make better decisions that actually meet the needs of people and of communities. So by not doing the engagement, it's not a cost neutral option. You're not saving money by not doing the engagement. It's always something I like to say as well. But once you've thought through all of these things, that is when you'd go on to select your method. And what I'll do now is I'll just talk through a couple of different methods that we've used in the last couple of years at Involve. So the first is a mixed methods approach that we worked alongside Camden Council to create their first ever data charter. So Camden wanted to create a data charter that would help govern how they manage, store and use public data to best support their communities in the borough. And they wanted it to be collaboratively created with their local communities so that it could reflect their needs, wants, and their values. The mixed methods process that we used had a couple of different strands to it, and they ran concurrently so that they all kind of fed in and supported each other. So I'll just talk through a few bits here. So from 2019 to 2021, we ran a number of what are called distributed dialogues. And these are small place-based group conversations with pre-existing community groups that were led by a community facilitator. We've got people together for about an hour to 90 minutes where they discussed with the support of a community facilitator their ideas and their experiences around data and kind of what they would like to see. We know data can sometimes be a bit of a tricky topic, or people might not have any experience or knowledge or feel very comfortable or confident talking about it. So we supported the community facilitators to engage, to kind of shape this conversation or steward this conversation by using case studies as a way to really connect people with like ongoing live data issues or ways that data would be used in their communities. And then what we did from that is we gathered all of the insights and all of the outcomes, and we fed those into the first data panel that happened at the end of 2021. So the first data panel, which was basically a citizens jury, brought together 20 local residents who were demographically reflective of Camden, and they came together over 3 days to share their own experiences, to hear evidence from speakers, to deliberate, and then ultimately to craft their first draft of Camden's data charter. And the inputs and the ideas from the distributed dialogues were also one of those bits of evidence that fed into that, so that we're really getting to hear a broader cross-section of the community's like perspectives and experiences, in addition to those 20 people that took part in the panel itself. So after that panel happened, they basically co-created this data charter that was then implemented by Camden Council. But they didn't want to stop there, because they were like, this is great, but how do we know if it's working? What do we know? How do we know what's kind of going on here? So in 2022, after the panel had finished, we ran a second iteration of the distributed dialogues. So we brought back some of the same community groups, but also some different ones. And what we did was a similar process with a community facilitator. And we basically looked through the data charter and kind of like reviewed and had to think about like, what do people think about this? But we also started to think about how it's being implemented and how is it being governed? Like, what do we think about that? How are we going to measure if this is successful? What's that going to look like? And then we used that information to help again inform the second panel that happened in 2023. So the second panel was made up of a new cohort of participants, and they had time to explore the data charter itself, to hear information from speakers, which included people from the first panel, so they could come and share their experiences and reflections with the second panel. And ultimately what they did with this panel was they reviewed the data charter, they made some kind of like recommendations for minor tweaks, but it was mainly focused on kind of looking at the implementation and the governance of the data charter. So how well is Camden actually doing at implementing this? How well is Camden living up to the kind of the principles that are in the data charter, and that kind of thing. So it was much more around that side of the accountability and the governance with the second panel. And it was just a really exciting project, to be honest, like to be part of, to see this whole process. And I popped on the side a couple of reflections of participants who took part in the various panels to kind of gather their views on what it was like to take part. But ultimately, we did see that garnered like a huge amount of kind of excitement from people. People started to engage with data in a way that they hadn't engaged with before, and really understood why it was important for them as residents to have a say and to have their voice heard in terms of how data is governed in their local community. We then have a Citizens Assembly as an example that we ran. I'm sure everyone knows about Citizens Assembly, so I won't go into it in too much detail. But we ran the People's Assembly for Nature back in 2023. And this was kind of the big 4 weekends, 103 people selected by Sortition with over 40 speakers who came to share their perspectives and experiences. And ultimately what they did as part of this process was they developed the People's Plan for Nature, which was a set of a kind of a vision statement and then some calls for actions and recommendations to shape the future of nature in the UK. But I'm sure that you know probably quite a lot about Citizens Assembly, so I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth to talk about the science-wise dialogues, because I'm aware of time as well.
Okay, so one of the projects that I mainly work on is ScienceWise. For those of you who don't know, it's a UK research and innovation funded program that offers match funding to run sort of participation events with the public to help inform research and policy, but focusing on science and technology. So basically what it is a member of the public come together with experts to deliberate on issues relevant to the future of policy or research decisions in science and technology. It's really good for developing research programs or policy at an early stage. If there's, as Maddie said before, if there's really strong public interest or overlapping or competing public interests in something, it's really good for sort of knotty complex topics to really get into what people think and to help inform decision makers, and yet complex or social issues which make the potential choices difficult. So I'm going to use as an example a specific dialogue that we ran called Future Flight 2. Unfortunately, we're just about to launch one on smart data, which would have been totally relevant for this group, but the results haven't come out yet, so I can't share them. But if anyone is interested in our dialogue on smart data, run with smart data research, please do get in touch with me and I can let you know when the results come out. But for this purpose, I'm going to look at Future Flight 2, which was a follow-on dialogue about the future of possible flight technologies and their use in the UK. So 43 participants came from across the UK and they held 7 workshops. So they started in an informing phase. They got to talk about the topics that they were interested in, learn about 3 particular future flight technologies, and sort of discuss their initial opinions. They heard from specialists. They deliberated together to help inform not just from their opinions, not just from the experts, but also from other people's opinions. And then after broadening their knowledge, they refined their deliberations into 14 principles for the deployment of future flight. It was a really interesting process for us actually, and the commissioners got lots of sort of surprising things that they weren't expecting. So one of the technologies they looked at was drones, so using drones to deliver packages or prescriptions and things like that. And they had people come from sort of built up areas and they had people come from rural areas, and they were expecting people from rural areas to really not want any technology in their skies. But actually, because the benefits to them of getting their prescriptions quick and easily were so much stronger, that the people in rural communities really saw the benefit of these future flight technologies, whereas the people in built up areas were more suspicious of them, which was something that they're really interested in. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was the focus of the public on sort of the economics of the technologies and how they would be implemented was like a really strong theme throughout everything. They thought it would come up, but everything that was discussed, all the different aspects, sort of underpinned by the socio-economic impacts of them. So it's very interesting. The things that it fed into, so the actual impacts it had, one of the requirements for ScienceWise is that it is actually going to feed into some kind of research or policy. So the findings are referenced in the government's drone ambition statement, which was quite a big coup. The findings informed changes to the DFT's transport technology tracker and is being used by Innovate UK. And then the home institution of the commissioners was the University of Birmingham. And through Innovate UK, they launched 7 research grant calls and 2 policy fellowships, and these were designed based on the findings of the dialogue. So it was a very successful project. Yeah. Thanks.